Hi there, my name is Alexis Rinaldi, and today I'm going to be sharing with you my EDU 604 Memory, Memoir, and Mastery presentation. I read the book The Skin That We Speak by Lisa Delpit and Joanne Kilgore Dowdy. In this book, each chapter focuses on a different story or topic related to people being treated unfairly for not speaking standard English. The course objective that was met as a result of reading and analyzing this book was to evaluate the nature of race relations and prejudice. The reason this objective was met is because this book presented several detailed examples of students being prejudged because of the dialect and English language they spoke. I would now like to take the time to break down this chapter by chapter for you. Each chapter was packed with enlightening stories and information. In part 1, chapter 1 of this book, Joanne Kilgore Dowdy from Trinidad, middle class and black, grew up feeling like she had to think before she spoke in order to use a different dialect than she was taught growing up, British English, to sound more educated and please others. In chapter 2, we learned that Ernie Smith grew up being taught Ebonics was the correct way to speak, but then he was criticized for humiliated for speaking that way by his teachers at school. In part 2, chapter 3, 11-year-old Maya is an African American who grew up speaking standard American English at home, but started using Ebonics just from spending time with her African American friends at school. In chapter 4, a high school teacher introduces the term trilingualism. Trilingualism refers to the fact that everyone uses different language for 3 different settings: home, formal, and professional. In chapter 5, it is discussed that Michael Stubbs interviewed 2 14-year-old girls. He played them a recording of dialect speech, and the girls interpreted the speaker as having been badly brought up. After some conversation, Stubbs picks up on a phrase the child keeps using, sort of. And after some convincing, the child realizes that she has language habits she never realized she had before herself. Part 2 continued into Chapter 6, and Chapter 6 discussed that assessing language of African American children is invalid and unfair if it is geared towards standard American English. We need to renovate the system. Chapter 7 discussed the story of Shannon, who is 6 years old and speaks the African American language. She's asked to think about and write one sentence about something special to her. She is self-conscious about her language, so when the teacher notices this, the teacher tells her, maybe try tomorrow. The teacher gave the student permission to fail rather than demanding success from her. Carter Forshey suggested the solution of connecting music to writing instead in this situation. In the last chapter of Part 2, Chapter 8, discussed that language discrimination is not limited to a black-white issue. Language, like Southern Mountain dialect, also has common stereotypes. The root of the stereotype is because in rural areas in the South, some people live too far away from schools to attend, and for this reason, parents are uneducated themselves, so can't help their children. In Chapter 9, the first chapter of Part 3, it is discussed that teacher and test language has many aspects to examine, such as inflection, tone, modulation, and vocabulary. For example, some 6-year-old girls were answering a question that showed a picture of a woman mopping the floor and asked, "She likes to blank," and the answer was supposed to be mop. The students looked at this as a social issue, so the teacher gave them credit even though they put the wrong answer to stand up for a woman. Then, in Chapter 10, it explained the challenges that were faced trying to get the Students' Right to Their Own Language Act passed. Part 3 contained the last 2 chapters of this book. Chapter 11 discussed that teacher candidates are sometimes turned away because their language is not standard English. 2 examples are given. Linda, an African American who did not appear or sound the same as most teachers, so struggled in the teacher preparation program. And Tanya, an African American who grew up learning standard English because her parents were afraid she would be negatively judged if she did not speak that way. In the final chapter, Chapter 12, high school journalism students did not feel comfortable asking questions at an award ceremony and workshop, so they were asking the teachers to ask their questions for them because they said, "We don't talk great." The first assigned question aligned with the specific book is, how does language reflect our cultural identity, power, and privilege? Having common language-based stereotypes can leave students feeling less than those who speak standard American English. This gives those who speak standard American English an unfair privilege. All educators should be required to take a course on this topic so they are aware of and can prevent the negative power and privilege they can inflict on their students, commonly without even realizing. This issue is especially important to address because due to the influx of immigrants entering the U.S. educational system, the number of students who speak a native language other than English has grown dramatically, and it will, or it's predicted to, account for about 40% of the school-age population by the year 2040. The second assigned question aligned with the specific book is, what could you do to assist these culturally and linguistically diverse students to be successful socially and academically? Well, according to the article Bridging Cultures in Our Schools, New Approaches That Work, Knowledge Brief, a critical step in making schools places where all children can learn is for educators to first see how their own cultural values operate in the classroom. After the educator examines their own culture, then they can examine student culture and find ways to bridge the two together. When discussing this topic, it is also important to note that language taught at home is strongly connected to an achievement gap. Students of different socioeconomic status do not have equal opportunities and access to learning resources. And according to the Educator's Handbook for Understanding and Closing Achievement Gaps, the academic achievement gap by family socioeconomic status traces substantially to an unequal learning opportunities in the children's home environments. My biggest takeaway from this book is that students who do not speak standard American English are not making mistakes speaking in English. Instead, they are speaking the correct way they were taught to speak in their home environment. Everyone, even those who speak standard American English, speak differently at home, formal, and professional scenarios. I can admit I have made some unintentional mistakes with my students who do not speak standard American English that were mentioned in this book, but I am so glad I now looked at this topic from a different perspective and have a much better understanding of how to teach students who speak differently in a more inclusive and effective way. Here's my reference page if you're interested in diving deeper into this topic. Thank you for listening to my presentation.